September is a big month around here in central Indiana because a lot of weather changes start to happen. I'm 13 News meteorologist Matt Standridge. We wanted to take a closer look at what September typically brings. We'll put some numbers to it, and then how this September could be a little bit different in some ways, but also kind of average, status quo in others. This is the daylight change map. This is the reason why we have different seasons. You get different daylight amounts, different sun angles, different heating and cooling of the atmosphere in different spots, and all those try to come together to produce our season. So we're coming up here in September. We end summer officially, and then we start fall. That happens over at the fall equinox. Now, technically, meteorologists, we say meteorological fall starts at the beginning of September. But the reason why is we start to really see some cooler air come into Indiana. And one reason why is the daylight change. This map shows you the changes we have across the country. The farther north you go, the bigger the daylight change. Farther south you go, a little bit less. All the way to the tropics or the Tropic of Cancer and of Capricorn, you don't get too many of those fluctuations. But here in Indiana, we're in this kind of royal blue category, showing a decrease of at least 70 minutes. Here are the official daylight losses that we'll have across the state. Just shy of an hour and 20 minutes there in South Bend, an hour and 9 minutes in Evansville, but Indianapolis 1 hour and 14 minutes. So you put that with the time, and we were talking about sunrises there a little bit later in the 7 o'clock hour, and our last 8 p.m. sunsets happen in the first couple of weeks across central Indiana here in September. And then later in the month, we go back to 7 o'clock sunsets. Now, this has nothing to do with time changes or whatever the time the government says it is. This is just natural. This happens every September. You put this all together, that day lost 1 hour, 14 minutes for Indianapolis. September is our biggest daylight loss that we have throughout the entire year. And so we'll start to see that pace gradually decrease as we head towards Christmas time. But we're losing about 2 to 2.5 minutes of daylight every single day, and sometimes even more than 2.5 minutes of daylight. So September, we really start to notice a big change, and you can see the temperature change as well. Our average highs at the beginning of the month start right around 83 degrees for Indianapolis. They end up at 73 degrees. So cooler air is coming in. Now, throughout the month of August for 2025, we've had some decent cool downs. And the start of September has been on the cooler side. And we continue to see it being a bit on the cooler side. But overall in September, more 70s than 80s from an average perspective are likely. It's also technically our wettest month, or our driest month of the year. When we're looking at the rainfall totals, August, September, October, it's almost a three-way tie, but technically September is our driest month of the year, just over 3 inches. Now, heading into the month, we've been dry for a while, and so we'll have to watch to see if drought conditions develop this month. I'll show you kind of the outlook here in just a moment, but a few more things I want to touch on, things that you may notice throughout the month of September. Fall leaves, for example. Now, at the start of the month, you're driving around, you may see kind of a tree every once in a while, that a rogue one where it just starts to change color. Maybe it looks a little less green than it was. That'll be the case, but that's going to be more and more the case throughout the month. By the end of the month, we start to get more of a difference between low and moderate color across the state. More moderate color to the north. You're still a few levels away from peak. That peak will be there towards the very start of November across the state. But we're starting to see a little bit more color change. Really, October, you see the biggest change happen, and then right towards Halloween, we're closer to that peak. Also, full moon. This month will be the night of September 7th, so it still look full the night of the 7th and the 9th of the 8th. But it's called the full corn moon, also called the harvest moon. We also have the leaves turning moon. That's one, in the rutting moon as well. This is a lot of times when the deer start breeding as temperatures are cooling off. So a couple different names, harvest moon and corn moon, very appropriate for Indiana. Technically, the USDA has our average corn harvest date, the start date, being about September 20th. But we've already had reports, that's just an average, of some farmers going ahead and starting to cut their fields in parts of Indiana. But you're going to see a lot more combines out here throughout the month of September. Also in the month of September, we really watch the hummingbirds leave. At the very end of August, they've been busy feeding up on our bird feeders. You all were telling us how many times you had to refill the bird feeder because the hummingbirds were sucking everything dry, and you've probably had a lot of different hummingbirds out there if you had the bird feeders out. But the first 2 weeks of September, we typically start to see a lot of them leave, but it's a gradual thing, and that's kind of the peak. There will still be some hummingbirds and some stragglers, possibly into mid-October. Usually we kind of wrap the hummingbird season completely up by Halloween. The males leave first, then the females, the young, the new chicks, they actually last for a little bit longer, kind of getting the leftover scraps, and then they head south, but they don't even have their parents to fly south with them. They can do it all on their own. But they like to use a light north wind in order to do it, kind of helps their flight. And speaking of wind, we're starting to look ahead towards the windiest time of the year. In the summer, there's not as much wind. I mean, you can get thunderstorms to produce some wind, but from an average day-to-day look, it's not as windy. We're in our least windy time of the year, but we're starting to see the slow uphill climb in that average wind speed on a day-to-day basis. The windiest time of year is there January right through March, right in the heart of winter when those bitter north winds come in. But gradually we'll see a little bit more wind in our day after day. Now earlier we're also talking about daylight changes. One thing that accompanies that is the sun angle. And we've already seen quite a dip from our sun angle. It peaks at 74 degrees above the horizon. This is not drawn to scale. This is just kind of give you a rough look. But in September, look how much lower the sun is in the sky. 47 degrees there at solar noon. So pretty much kind of halfway up in the sky, maybe a little bit more than that. So you're starting to see longer shadows, especially on the trees in the evening, maybe on the back deck. You probably noticed the house casting a little bit longer of a shadow, and that'll be the case the rest of the season. So not only do we have less daylight, but the sun angle is starting to get a little bit lower, so it's not as intense. You put all those things together, we start cooling off. Speaking of sun angle though, the sunburn time really goes down. The UV index for September, 6.5 to 7. So we're not quite up there like we were earlier in the summer. Here at the late summer, early fall area, you know, the UV index definitely goes down a little bit. And partially this is due not just to the sun angle, but of some extra clouds out there. We're going to gradually see more clouds coming in. You just see a lot of changes slowly taking place throughout the month of September. Now let's talk about severe weather chances. When you look at a country as a whole, we don't get a lot of severe weather in the month of September. Now, there's kind of this secondary peak of severe weather in the spring, right? Spring is the main severe weather season, fall is that secondary peak. It's not as big as the spring one, but still in September, it's just a little bit on the weaker side. Notice how there's kind of this arc here too. This is coming in from the Storm Prediction Center. Some of this kind of still has to do if there's a high pressure system still sitting in the deep south, and you can get a couple thunderstorms right along the leading edge of that. But usually September is a quieter month. I mean, when you look at Indiana's rainfall, it is our driest month, but we still can get storms. They're definitely on the very low side. Not zero, but definitely a little bit on the lower side. What's interesting though about this map for the tornadoes is that, yeah, you still kind of have this arc that we're talking about. But then notice along the Gulf Coast, it's not necessarily it's severe weather season for the Gulf Coast, but rather this has to do with hurricane season. When you get these hurricanes that are making landfall, especially there on that right front quadrant of the hurricane, you can get enhanced rotation and a couple tornadoes. And when you look at the averages, then you actually kind of get this another little peak of tornado activity along the Gulf Coast. This really only happens unless there's a hurricane coming in. Usually the overall storm systems and patterns don't really produce as much severe weather, but rather you have to have a hurricane coming in. This is another way to look at it. Average number of September tornadoes. This is over just over the past 2 decades or so since the year 2000. And notice how the highest counts are there in the Carolinas and even Florida. Florida has the highest count when it comes to average tornadoes, once again, due to the hurricane season. Indiana, 1. It's one of our lowest months for tornado activity on average. Not saying it can't happen, but usually a little bit quieter. Let's talk more about the hurricane season because we were just talking about the tornado uptick there in Florida. Season lasts all the way to November 30th, so we still have a ways to go. This blue area shows you where we can get any kind of tropical activity, whether it starts there or it starts to strengthen or where it goes from there on out. But it can't go south of the equator, so that's why you see that north of the equator. But anything is kind of open access here in parts of the western Atlantic north of the equator. When you look at the season itself, peak season is here in September. So we'll have to keep a very close eye in the month ahead. When we look so far at this hurricane season, though, these big fronts that we've had throughout the month of August have somewhat helped to keep things a little bit at bay there, right closer to the Gulf Coast and the eastern coast. But we'll really have to look out over this next month. There's a big peak Water temperatures are warm. We just got to see how the wind shear is going to be here in some of these source regions. This shows you where most of the activity is. This is coming in from the National Hurricane Center. So this is kind of the brightest colored map that they have because September is peak. You see the deeper red colors, those show you where we get a lot of the named storms either forming or where they travel to next. Now, closer to the coast, there are a number of storm systems that can rapidly develop by the coastline, and then others will develop farther out towards the east. If they form out way to the east, that gives us a little bit more time to track them. In fact, if they form way out east of the greater and lesser Antilles, you can at least have a week or so before they could get all the way towards the U.S. coastline. Now, if they develop anywhere near the coastline, something can make landfall in a day or two. So we'll have to closely watch different thunderstorms that are developing in the Gulf and parts of the Western Atlantic up and down the eastern seaboard. Any storm systems, if there's any kind of leftover thunderstorms just sitting there, and we'll see if they organize or anything like that, that could quickly make landfall. But then we also keep an eye out off towards the east, but that gives us a little bit more time. But many times, if they form a little bit more on the northern side of this 8+ days, a lot of times they're able to swing back out to sea. So we'll keep a close eye on the tropics. And we keep a close eye on the tropics here in Indiana still, not because we get landfalls, of course. I mean, we're super landlocked other than Lake Michigan. We have access. If you want to go all the way out towards the ocean, technically you could by Lake Michigan. But when you have storm systems that hit the coast, we have to watch the steering winds that are already in place over the United States. Many times if a system comes into Texas and it goes north and it wraps to the east, we can get some rain. Now, one thing we had weird and definitely record-breaking in some perspectives, but Hurricane Helene that made landfall there in the Big Bend region of Florida, it actually took, from the storm's perspective, a left-hand turn. It went off towards the west due to steering patterns that we had. We had a big high pressure there over parts of Ontario and Quebec, and it helped to drive it actually to the west. And we had our own wind spike here in Indiana. In fact, we had some of the highest winds for a landlocked state, not even necessarily parts of Tennessee or Virginia, but we did just by the curvature of the storm and how the winds were flowing around it and the trajectory of it too. That's pretty crazy there. So we have to watch in Indiana. Sometimes we can get a little wet. All right, we talked a lot. We've been kind of rambling about a lot of different things about the month of September. Big month of change. We're starting to end summer and head into the fall season. Really, there's kind of two seasons. There's winter and summer, right? And then there's the in-between. And we're going into the in-between, also known as fall, and where you can kind of get into this tug of war constantly in Indiana. So now we've talked about what we typically see. What does this September, what could it possibly bring? This is coming in from the Climate Prediction Center. This is the temperature outlook. They've got a kind of an outlook that warmer than average weather is possible, not guaranteed, but possible there for parts of the northern plains and the eastern Rockies. I've been looking at some of the jet stream patterns and some of the long range modeling too. There could be a little bit more high pressure sitting over the western plains. Well, we've noticed throughout the month of August, that was actually sitting more towards the Pacific coast. And what we were seeing is big warm-ups in the west, and then it just allowed cooler air, kind of abnormally cooler air coming in constantly, round after round, into the Great Lakes and right here in Indiana. This high, though, might meander a little bit farther towards the east. That would possibly kind of cut off some of that northerly flow right towards Indiana, some of it. We'll still get cool downs with cool fronts. But if we move the high pressure a little bit farther to the east, it may open up a little bit more towards New England. In fact, New England was not getting as cool as we were. The shots of cool air were kind of shallow, but they were coming right towards the Mississippi River and then right over the Great Lakes, right into Indiana. But this time, if this pattern holds, more New England could see a couple of those shots of cooler air. But there's not a clear sign yet, and that's why you don't see a lot of blue on the map either, but something that we'll have to watch. Overall, for the month of September, we're not really seeing in Indiana a big swing towards a bunch of cooler than normal weather or warmer than normal weather. When you put everything together, we'll have ups and downs, but they may kind of equalize. So that would be a very typical September for us. When it comes to rainfall, we could use a little bit. August ended pretty dry. We only had about an inch for the month of August. We should get about 3.5 inches or so. So we got about a third of what we'd normally get. So we're a little dry. In September, there's not really a clear sign. Really, I'll show you kind of the weather pattern in a moment, and this kind of helps explain it too. But we may see a little bit more activity There are parts of the central plains with a couple thunderstorms that could be out there, but for the most part, we're expecting about average. You know, there's really not a clear sign one way or the other. And when it comes to the jet stream, what we're really noticing is that it's pretty zonal. And when I say zonal, I know the banner's kind of covering it a little bit. When I say zonal, there's not huge dips with it from an average perspective. Sometimes there will be dips, especially for what we were talking about earlier, the eastern Great Lakes and New England. But the jet stream will probably be on the weaker side. And when it's east to west like this, it doesn't usually produce big storm systems. And so kind of a quiet month. I mean, September usually is a quieter month for us, but it may really stick to that quieter pattern as we look ahead. So we'll watch that closely. We're also watching the polar regions here up towards the Arctic. Slowly but surely, the ice is starting to come back. Because once you get farther north, they're losing daylight way faster than we are. And at night, their nights are going to be getting longer here shortly, but the sun angle is also really low in the sky, and so you lose more heat than you gain in the polar regions. That's one reason why we have the polar regions, why it's colder in the Arctic, but we've already seen that process start to take place. This is typically normal. This is one reason why we've had some cool downs at the end of summer for Indiana, because of all the cool air and the ice and the snowpack that's starting to develop, like typical, and head towards the south. But we were noticing there wasn't as much of that activity in Alaska and parts of far western Canada. They were warmer, so the cold air that was building over this ice had to go somewhere, so it went south right over the Hudson Bay and towards the Great Lakes, instead of maybe kind of spreading itself out a little bit more, a little bit towards Alaska, a little bit towards western Canada, and a little bit towards us. It was all towards us. So we'll continue to watch the snow and ice cover as we approach the month of September, and that could produce a few cool downs. Essentially, we really think your September is going to be pretty average. I know that sounds kind of like a cop-out, but what I'm saying is there's not really a huge sign that a bunch more cold air outbreaks are on its way or huge warm-ups. I mean, we may just kind of see a lot of average 70s and 80s out there, but if we don't get a lot of rainfall, we may have to start talking a little bit about drought conditions, and that could be something that we're watching out for. Not necessarily a flash drought like we had last late summer and fall, but we could start to see drier conditions if we don't kind of switch this pattern like we're thinking. But here we go, month of September. As that tug of war starts to begin, as winter's grip, or it starts to get a little bit stronger, and summer's grip starts to weaken a little bit more, and eventually more fronts will be on the way.